Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Colonel Art Athens. I have the distinct pleasure of being the director of the Naval Academy's Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, and I'd like to welcome you to the William C. Stutt lecture that we have each year. Mr. Stutt, for whom the lecture is named, was a 1949 graduate of the Naval Academy, where he lettered on the varsity lacrosse team. He served in the Navy for 5 years and then began postgraduate work at the London School of Economics and earned a master's in business administration from the Harvard Business School. Mr. Stutt joined the investment firm Goldman Sachs and eventually became a limited partner in this prestigious firm. Mr. and Mrs. Stutt established this speaker series in 2005, and they established it because they realized how important it was for our future officers to think about the subjects that are addressed during this lecture series. Our distinguished and accomplished guest speaker tonight is Dr. David Rodin. Dr. Rodin is one of the world's foremost authorities on ethics. His work has helped transform the ethics of conflict and security, and he advises some of the world's largest private and public organizations, as well as several Western militaries. Dr. Rodin is the co-director of the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict, and teaches at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. A Rhodes Scholar from New Zealand, Dr. Rodin received his bachelor in philosophy and his doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University. In 2011, the World Economic Forum selected him as a Young Global Leader, a title that recognizes the most distinguished young leaders in all fields under the age of 40. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Rodin.
Thank you so much, Art. I really appreciate that. Well, it's a wonderful privilege and an honor to be here in this distinguished venue to be addressing you here tonight. I really appreciate you all coming out to hear me on a Tuesday evening. I realize you didn't have much choice, but I appreciate it nonetheless. We were just reflecting as we came in here, actually, what a privilege it really is to have the opportunity to spend this time with you here tonight when you consider the impact and the influence that you will have through your careers on the future shape and operations of the Navy. So I really appreciate spending this time. So I wanted to start by asking you all a rather personal question. And that question is, why did you choose to join the Navy? And obviously, one answer to that question is you joined the Navy because you wanted to beat Army. And I get that. I bought my Beat Army t-shirt in the midshipman's store this afternoon, and I will wear that proudly when I return. I knew that would guarantee an applause. But if we understand that question a little bit more broadly, to say, why did you join the armed forces? What was it that made you choose a career in military service? And I suspect that there are a number of different things that might have lied behind that for many of you. For some, it may have been the sense of adventure and excitement that the career offers. Some of you may have come from families which has a long tradition of military service. But I suspect also that for many of you, a very important part of the reason why you're here is your sense that there is such thing as a good fight. And that fighting that good fight is an enormously important and honorable thing to devote your career to. And so what I want to try and do today is to explore a little bit how we might understand this idea of fighting a good fight. And to reflect a little bit on what that might mean for the future shape of the Navy as an organization and for your role as future commanders and for future leaders. And I want to take you through some considerations that I hope are going to be somewhat challenging for you. They may be very challenging for some of you. But I'm hoping that it's going to lead us to some interesting places. Now, right at the outset, some of you may be thinking or asking, and I think completely justifiably, I'm a philosopher, I'm an academic, I've never spent any time in combat operations. I've never been under fire. I've never even actually been to a combat zone. So you might be thinking, why on earth should we listen to this guy? What can he tell us about the ethics of war and what it is to fight a good fight? And I think the open answer to that, or the honest answer, is that you really shouldn't listen to what I say, in the sense that I don't view the role, my role today, or the role of philosophy more generally, to tell you what is or is not a good fight, what is or is not the right way to comport yourself as a military leader. The role of philosophy, when it's done well, is to raise questions which will hopefully be useful to you in forging your own identity as the kind of commander that you want to be. So philosophy, when done well, is a kind of discourse. It's a discourse between you and me, and I'm hoping that we're going to have time for some good questions at the end. It's a discourse between you and your peers, and it's also a discourse between you and yourselves. And the role of philosophy done well is to raise the kinds of questions that may be difficult questions, they may be hard questions, but they should be the kind of questions that will enable you to be better officers, better leaders, and better human beings. That's really the ambition here today. And as I say, you'll have all the opportunity to tell me where I've gone wrong and the questions at the end. So let's think a little bit about what we might mean by this idea of fighting a good fight. What do we mean by that? So first sense, or a first approximation, might be to say that to fight a good fight is to have the competencies of a proficient combatant. To have mastery over the technical skills to do your job well and consistently and reliably, and to have the personal qualities that enable you to succeed in an operational context, to reach operational mission success, to have the tenacity, to have the grit, to have courage under fire. And that doing all of that, if you have mastery of that set of capabilities and competencies, that's what it is to fight the good fight. And I think it's pretty clear that that can't be a sufficient account of what that means. It's clear that having those capabilities, those capacities, those masteries over the technical and personal domain, it's a necessary feature for fighting the good fight. You can't fight well without mastering that, but it can't be sufficient, because we know through history that many forces have had very, very high degree of tactical and strategic and operational mastery and competence, but we would not in any way say that they were fighting a good fight. Think, for example, today about some of the achievements of ISIS or of Al-Qaeda, who were able to achieve really very, very striking operational, tactical, and strategic success using very minimal resources, but nobody would say that they were fighting a good fight. Now, why is that? It's pretty obvious that the reason is that their actions were in no way constrained by any sense of moral responsibility or obligation. They attack civilians, they engage in acts of terror, they engage in acts of torture, of sexual abuse, of rape. Nobody who does those things could ever be considered to be fighting a good, honorable, and admirable fight. So you might say, well, that leads us to a better account of what it is to fight the good fight. To fight a good fight is to have mastery over the professional competencies of an effective combatant, have combat proficiency, and to do all of that within the requirements of morality. So what do we mean by that? What is it to be fighting within the requirements of what morality demands of us? Now, I know that all of you are going through the ethics course at the moment. Some of you have been through it, some of you are partway through it. So you'll know that there is a very well-developed account of what morality requires of combatants within the tradition of what we call just war theory. And just war theory gives us an account of the requirements for combatants in that part of the theory that deals with the actions of combatants in war. Who can tell me what that's called? The component of just war theory that deals with how soldiers ought to comport themselves in conduct. It's a Latin name. It starts with jus. Jus and bello, right. The justice of action within war. And we know that there are a number of elements that are contained within jus and bello. Number one, combatants have to direct force only against enemy combatants, right? They have to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, and they should only intentionally target combatants. They should never intentionally target non-combatants. Their actions ought to be proportionate, by which we mean that the harm that the action inflicts, both on combatants and on non-combatants, can't outweigh, it can't be greater than the good that they achieve through engaging in that action. It has to be proportionate. And thirdly, it has to be necessary. What we mean by that is that you shouldn't undertake any harm-producing military action if there is a less harmful way of achieving that same effect. There are a whole series of other rules that also have to do with treatment of prisoners, have to do with perfidy and so forth, but that's really the kernel of it, right? So just war theory in its classical form says that in order to be respecting the moral constraints on combatants, you have to be abiding by those core requirements of the jus and bello. So you might think, well, that's really what it is to fight the good fight. It's to have that set of professional competences and capabilities and to abide by the norms of jus and bello, always to discriminate, always to act proportionately, always to act necessarily or with necessity. Now, we also know that there's another component of just war theory that deals not with the action of combatants within war, but the justice of the war itself. What's that part of it called? The jus ad bellum, right. The justice of the war. All right. So there's this other component of just war theory. Now the question is, does a combatant who wants to fight the good fight, do you have to worry about the justice of the operation or the war that you're engaged in? According to just war theory, you don't. At least in its classical interpretation. In its classical interpretation, there is a very significant division between the jus ad bellum, the justice of the war, which is taken to be the primary responsibility of the head of state, right? The president and Congress, the king, the parliament. It's that body or entity or person that has to ensure that the war meets the requirements of jus ad bellum, that it has a just cause, that it's necessary and proportionate in its totality, that it's conducted under a proper authority. But that a combatant, like all of you, a professional soldier, seaman, commander, doesn't need to worry about whether the operation or the war that he is fighting in is just or not, as long as he is fighting in accordance with the rules of jus and bello. Now, over the last 15 years or so, 10, 15 years, a new body of work, of philosophy, has started to challenge that old traditional view. The view that there is a separation between the ad bellum and the in bello, and that one can fight well, can fight in accordance with what morality requires, simply by following the jus and bello, and without having to worry about whether the operation itself is just or unjust. Now, this new body of research is often called Revisionist Just War Theory. And it starts from a number of different arguments. And the place that it's really going to, the conclusion that it wants to arrive at, is that in order to be fighting well, to be fighting a morally good fight, it's a necessary component, not only that you have professional competence and capability, not only that you're fighting discriminately and proportionately and following the in bello, but also that the campaign, the operation, the war is itself morally justified. Now, that's a very, very striking conclusion, but here are a couple of arguments for it. First argument you could call the argument from self-defense. So let's imagine a scenario, not in a war situation, but in a domestic situation. There are a bunch of armed robbers who are robbing a bank. And there is an armed police force that comes to respond to the robbery. And in the course of their response, they open fire on the bank robbers. They do so properly and appropriately within the context of their mandate as officers of the law. And in order to defend themselves, the bank robbers start firing back against the police. Now the question is, are the bank robbers justified in using force against the police officers? They're shooting at the police officers in order to protect their own life. Right? The police officers are certainly threatening them. But most people would say, no, the bank robbers don't get to use lethal force against the police officers because the police officers are doing what they are entitled to do. They are there using proper and appropriate force in order to enforce the law, and the bank robbers don't get to defend themselves with lethal force even though they're under threat from the police officers. That seems right. Transpose that now out of the domestic sphere of crime and police and think about the analog of that in the international arena. So let's say that we think about a context of a classic unjust war, a war of aggression. Say Germany's invasion of Czechoslovakia. It looks a little bit like the situation of the policeman and the bank robber, right? The Germans invade Czechoslovakia. The Czechs defend themselves. They expose the German soldiers to risk. But it's very hard to see why the Germans should have the right to use lethal force against those who are doing nothing more than exercising their appropriate rights of self-defense. So it starts to look like what the traditional just war theory tells us about this radical separation between the in bello and the ad bellum, where it's only the president or the executive that needs to worry about the justice of the war, and the soldiers can simply act and use force against enemy combatants in a way that's morally appropriate. It starts to look like that seems very, very problematic. Here's a second argument for that. So we saw a minute ago that just war theory tells us that if an action in bello is going to be permissible, it has to be proportionate. Right? It has to be the case that the harm that you inflict is proportionate to, it's not outweighed, it doesn't outweigh the good that you seek to achieve through that action. That seems straightforward enough. But think a little bit more carefully about how that comparison gets to be made, right? So the harm that you inflict, let's say that it's collateral harm inflicted against enemy non-combatants. That's clearly a moral harm, right? It's a moral bad. What proportionality is telling us is that we need to balance that against the good achieved by the objective of the operation. Let's say that the objective is destroying a bridge or destroying a supply chain or an artillery installation. How do we think about what the moral value of that is, right? Destroying an enemy asset. I mean, it's pretty clear that just destroying an asset on its own doesn't have a moral value, either positive or negative. It gets its moral value from the contribution that it makes to the operation as a whole. And whether destroying that asset has a positive or a negative value will depend upon the morality of the campaign as a whole, right? Destroying an asset of an unjust campaign will be a moral good. Destroying an asset that's contributing towards a justified war, a just campaign, will not be a moral good. It'll be a moral harm. So it looks like to even make sense of this notion of proportionality as a moral comparison, we need to think about the status, the moral status of the campaign as a whole. That's what this new body of theory, revisionist just war theory, tries to argue. That we can't separate the ad bellum from the in bello. We can't separate the justice of the war as a whole from the justice of action within the war. Now, if you believe that, if you think that there's something to that set of arguments, what follows from that? It turns out a whole lot follows from that. So one of the things that seems to follow is that there is some kind of a requirement for soldiers and servicemen to think about not only the nature of their action within a campaign, whether it's proportionate, whether it's necessary, whether it distinguishes between combatants and non-combatants, but a requirement for them to think about the ad bellum as well. Is this war or this operation or this campaign that I am being asked or ordered to participate in, is it really a justified campaign? And it seems to imply that if the answer to that is not, if you have good reason to believe that the campaign is not justified, then there is a requirement to disobey the order to fight in it. I'll say that again. It would seem that there is some kind of a requirement to consider the justice of the war, and that if you truly believe that it is not justified, it would seem that there is some requirement to disobey the order to participate. So I remember back in 2004, when Britain, together with the US, had just participated in what in Britain we called Operation Telek, the invasion of Iraq. I was teaching at the Defense Academy at Shrivenham, and an officer came up to me after the class. He was a lieutenant colonel in your pronunciation, and he said, Professor Rodin, I really have significant worries about this operation. I think it's probably unlawful, and I think it's probably unjust. And I said to him, well, are you going? And he said, yes. It's my job, it's my duty. I have an order to go, I'm going to go. Now think a little bit about the implication of what he was saying. By his own lights, he believed that he was participating in an unjust invasion of another state. Now, the men and women who were fighting against him, some of those presumably were Al-Qaeda terrorists who were behaving in a completely reprehensible and immoral way. But some of them presumably were patriots who were doing nothing more or less than we would do if our state were invaded. They were defending their country with force, some of which may have been permissible within the bounds of jus and bello. Now think about the morality of using force against a combatant. We're not talking about non-combatants. Against a combatant who is doing nothing more than engaging in appropriate and permissible defensive harm. It looks a little bit like the morality of the bank robber shooting against the policeman. And in that case, it's pretty clear that we view action of that kind as being comparable to murder. Why shouldn't we say the same thing about this case? Now, one of the things that critics of this revisionist just war theory often say is they say, look, the argument is true in the abstract, it's true in theory, but in reality, it really doesn't make sense to hold ordinary soldiers, sailors, combatants responsible for these big matters of jus ad bellum, of the justice of war. It just doesn't make a sense. For a start, combatants are ignorant. They don't know whether a war is just or not. And they can't know, because whether it's just or not depends upon lots of very, very complicated information that they may not even have access to. So it doesn't really make sense to hold them responsible for deciding whether the war is just or not. And they say, look, soldiers and sailors and combatants are subject to very, very strong coercive forces. If they simply say that they're not going to follow an order to fight, they might face prosecution, they might face imprisonment. In some countries, they might face something worse. They might face a firing squad. It's just unreasonable to ask people to make those determinations in that context. But when you think about it from your perspective, right, when you think about it from the first personal perspective, or from the perspective of my officer in Britain, those objectives don't really seem to bite, right? So think again about my British officer. He had already come to the conclusion that the war was unjust. So it's not the case that he was facing some invincible ignorance. He'd read the newspapers, he'd read the reports, and that was his view. It was the view of many, many at that time. And equally, it doesn't seem sufficient to say, you can't expect me to make that decision because of the threat of imprisonment or the threat of coercion. The question for each of you is, well, how should I react in a situation like that? In a situation where I believe that something is wrongful, but maybe the institution does not, and maybe the institution is ready to take very significant steps against you. Posed that way, it really seems like a question of moral courage. So the first implication of this view seems to be something like a duty not to participate in wars that are unjust, even if the government, the command, requires you to do so. But equally, the converse may be the case. It's possible that there may be situations where there is an overwhelming moral case for using force, but where your orders are to abstain from that. And there's a very, very interesting case, which is the case of a Canadian general, General Romeo Dallaire. Some of you may know of this case. So Dallaire was the commander of the UN forces in Rwanda at the time when the genocide there was just starting. And Dallaire wrote a memo to his boss at that time, who was Kofi Annan, who was the head of peacekeeping operations at the UN, saying, give me the authorization to set up roadblocks, to use force against the gangs, the Interahamwe, who were organizing themselves to start the genocide. And we believe that we can close this genocide down, this emerging genocide. And subsequent analyses have endorsed that view. It probably was very likely that with his troops in theater at that time, he probably could have done that. But Kofi Annan, under the direction significantly of then President Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright, who was Secretary of State at that time, said, no, we're not going to go down there. It was very shortly after the debacle in Somalia, and they ordered him to stand down. Now, arguably, if you think that there is something like a requirement not to fight in unjust wars, even if ordered to do so, then on the other side, presumably, there is something like a presumption of some kind to use force where there's an overwhelming moral justification for doing so, even if ordered not to do so. It seems to cut both ways. Now again, I don't want to suggest that these are decisive reasons or arguments. There are a lot of considerations that will also come into play with this, and clearly the decision not to obey an order is a very, very significant and profound one. But what I'm trying to suggest to you is that when you look at the matter from the perspective of what a morality requires of us, that is not simply a morality that says the use of force is permissible when you are threatened by another actor, which is what traditional just war theory seem to imply, but one that starts from an account of human rights, which says something like you're permitted to use force against another actor when they are using force wrongfully, either against you or some third party. That when you start from that presumption, then these kinds of considerations come into play, and that they're real and they have to be thought through. Now, let me finish off, because I know that I want to leave some time for questions at the end, with reflecting a little bit about what these considerations might mean for you as you go through your career as officers, as leaders within the Navy, and for the Navy institutionally as well. So I think that it raises a number of very, very difficult questions, both for you as individual leaders and for the Navy and the armed forces as institutions. One of the questions it raises is, to what extent do we want to go down this road? To what extent do we want to permit or to encourage individual servicemen to be thinking about these kinds of questions, to be engaging in moral reflection about some of the highest and most difficult questions of political morality? When should we fight and when should we not? The traditional view of military service has been primarily a collectivist view. It's one that viewed individual soldiers as, in a sense, a part of a mass that was directed by a brain and a moral sensibility in kind of the way that the body is directed by the mind or the brain. So the brain was the political sovereign, and the army was simply the body. And its role was to perform the actions mandated by the brain. For a whole variety of reasons, that collectivizing view seems to be breaking down. It's breaking down partly because of the way that we as societies are thinking about the role of individuals. We're no longer as happy as we once were to define ourselves as simply being part of a collective. But in many, many different dimensions, there is the sense that individuals can, and some maybe perhaps ought to, assert themselves as individuals, not simply as part of a mass. It's occurring partly because of the role of technology. Because technology enables us to have access to information in ways that we never could before, even within the battlefield itself. It empowers us to act in ways, as individuals, in ways that we could not have done a generation or so ago. And it provides opportunities for those outside of the military to discover the kinds of actions that are occurring. You only have to think about how many people carry camera phones with them all around the world. And a third reason that I think these changes are occurring is because of the rise of the notion of human rights. When you think about the period from the end of the Second World War until today, one of the greatest transformations has been the rise and globalization of a notion that human beings all possess rights. And that amongst the most important of those are the rights not to be killed or maimed or harmed. And if that's true, then there doesn't seem to be any reason why those rights or the possession or exercise of those rights should stop at the boundaries of the battlefield. If we possess rights, we possess them everywhere and at all times. And if that's the case, then the ethics of war becomes, in a sense, the ethics of how we understand it can be permissible to harm, given the fact that human beings possess rights. So we move from a world in which the morality of war is defined by a very strict account of jus in bello, which governs the morality of war by creating distinctions between classes of individuals, masses again, combatants, non-combatants, to a much more complex and variegated world where we have to say, given that we all have rights, how should we understand the permissibility of harming and liability within that? So I don't know what the answer to those questions are. How organizations like the Navy should deal with that, how you as leaders ought to deal with it. But I know that you're going to have to deal with those questions as you move through your career. They will be there, they will be present, and you will need to find a way to respond to them. Just before I stop for questions, if there's any thought that I'd like to leave you with, it's the thought that we should think of ethics as being, in a sense, the highest domain of military strategy. What I mean by that is we're very familiar with the idea that tactics has to be subordinated to strategy, right? So an action could be tactically very brilliant, but it could be deficient or defective or even frustrate a broader strategic objective. And in a similar way, I want to argue that strategy itself should be seen as subordinate to ethics, where ethics is understood in the broader sense as an account of what we ought to be aiming towards. So just as something can be tactically brilliant but strategically deficient, something could be strategically brilliant in the sense that it is extremely effective at achieving a given objective, but that objective itself may be severely, severely deficient. So I want to leave you with the thought that at the very, very highest level, military craft is about ethics. I'll leave there and be very happy to take your questions for the time we have remaining. Thank you. Sure.
Good evening, sir. Midshipman Third Class Costa. I had a question about discrimination. Do you think it would be morally responsible to put a increased responsibility on local commanders rather than a general who writes an ROE to decide in a place like the Middle East where discrimination is becoming a lot more difficult? Do you think it would be morally responsible to say, okay, second lieutenant, you get to decide if that person is a combatant or not?
Do I think that there is a reason to give more responsibility to the local commander than to the higher commander?
Yes, sir.
So it depends what you're meaning by responsibilities. Responsibility can have a lot of different meanings, right? So one of the reasons you could be asking that is, well, if the action is the wrong action, who should we punish? Another thing that you could be meaning is, well, insofar as we're thinking in the way that I've been suggesting about what are the conditions for making somebody liable to force, which of those two, the more senior or the more local, which of those would be liable to being harmed, assuming that you could harm either of them in ways that were equally effective. And I'm not sure in either of those cases that there's going to be a general account of that. When you look at situations like that, you find that the determinants of when somebody is liable, either to be harmed defensively or punitively, there are a lot of different things that will go into that. So as a general rule, I think there is some logic to saying that the most proximate cause of that is the one that ought to be held liable or most clearly liable for defensive harm. But I'm not sure that that's always the case. There's a lot of complexities within that. I'm not sure it's answered it completely, but I think it could go either way.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Good evening, sir. Midshipman Third Class Weston. The July 20th plot to kill Adolf Hitler, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and several other German officers, could be viewed as an example of an officer disagreeing with the morality of a campaign or war and thus taking actions to stop the conflict. Do you view him as a dangerous example in an extreme situation, or do you think that he's an example of what to do when faced with these types of extreme situations, sir?
I think he is a moral hero. There is no question about that. So one of the things I think that gives us pause about that is this view that an incredibly important part of the morality of soldiering is fidelity to one's own country. And I know that the Marines, or the Navy's motto, I'm not sure if it's your official motto, is not for self, but for country, right? The sense that is really the touchstone of the morality of action. But I think that from a broader moral perspective, from the one that I've been suggesting tonight, it's not clear that that can be the overriding account, right? It can't be the case that the overriding morality is my country right or wrong, because we know that countries, even the best countries, even those with the best and most noble constitutions and political fora, do sometimes make mistakes, make terrible mistakes. And it can't be the case that the morality of combat is exhausted by the furtherance of the national interest. So I think, the case of the Hitler plot is an extreme but very, very clear example of that. I would regard that individual as a moral hero. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening, Dr. Rodin. This is Third Class Hudgens. Our perception of morality stems mostly from Western philosophers, Greek philosophers who have shaped our Western view of the world. But we learn very little from philosophers that have shaped other areas of the world. Does this provincial understanding of global ethics harm our personal understanding of ethics as a whole?
No, that's a great question. So look, do you remember right at the outset of the talk where I said that philosophy, when done well, is a kind of discourse? And we should view that discourse as being, so in some sense being shaped by the objectives that we have for it. And this becomes particularly important, I think, when you're thinking about the context of international conflict. In the sense that what we're trying to do when we think about morality, when we think about ethics, is to give the reasons for our action and to test those through a dynamic interaction with those around us. So in the first instance, we need to be able to have that discourse with those who share many of our assumptions and many of our views about matters of rights and wrong, of justice, of responsibility. But as we kind of go outwards from that, we need to test how far that discourse actually takes us. So when we find groups who disagree profoundly about some of our moral assumptions, they might disagree about whether there are even such things as human rights, then we need to reach very, very extensively for what tools we can have to engage in a productive discussion that could enable us to come to some kind of agreement. And my own view is that it's very hard to tell at the outset whether that is possible. But we can't really tell that without engaging in that process of discussion, of discourse, of the sharing of reasons. But I think the other component of that is we should also be highly, highly attuned to the fact that we might be mistaken about that. Right? I mean, if you think that there really is such thing as objective answers to some of these questions, then it may well be the case that we have certain very profound aspects of this very, very clearly wrong. And you get a sense of that when you look back to the history of our own culture, of our own civilization. You don't need to go back very far to see views that were very commonly held about the role of women, about the rights of different races and cultures, about the rights of gays and of lesbians, to see that it's possible that we can get very, very big things very, very wrong for a long time. And I think we need to be always very, very attuned to that.
Thank you, Doctor.
Good evening, sir. Midshipman Third Class Beale, 12th Company. In going along with the examples for individuals who believe that there is some sort of moral wrong in the mission that they're trying to achieve, some would cite that Edward Snowden also had an opinion that the mission that he was contributing to was unjust, and that's why he took the actions that he did. But in this situation, you can see that the actions that he took were actually very irresponsible and caused a lot more harm than they did good. What would your opinions be on the responsibilities of people who disagree with a mission to do so in a responsible fashion?
Right, so great question. So I said in the course of the lecture that even if you believe this approach that I've been suggesting, that says that there is this obligation to think not only about your action within the campaign, but the morality of the campaign, that won't necessarily be a decisive or overriding reason. There are going to be a lot of other things that will come into that. So one of the things that you'll have to think about for anyone in this situation like that would be think, what would the consequences of my acting in that way have? What would the intended consequences be, and what would the unintended consequences be? In the case of Edward Snowden, one of the consequences of his action was that he materially endangered a number of people around the world through that action. So what you need to think about, so very much in the way that we think about the morality of collateral harm in a proportionality calculation, where we say, well, if I have a really important moral objective, it might be permissible to do that, even if certain innocent people will be harmed. And it's important that the harm there is not intended, right? It's an unintended consequence. That makes a difference. But the fact that innocent people are harmed is a material fact about whether it's permissible to do that. And so, to act responsibly in situations like that will always require thinking through what will be the second and third order consequences of that. Who will be harmed? What will the nature of the harm be? Will the harm be intended or unintended? And so forth. And it may well be the case that those considerations will override and outweigh the kind of, as it were, the prima facie obligation to do that. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, Midshipman Third Class Meyer, how much of the ethical standards of war are merely a product of the times Or have we finally stumbled upon a universal truth for the ethical conduct of war? I guess posed another way, how will war look, the ethics of war look 100 or 1,000 years from now?
So almost certainly very, very different. So there's a great notion that we have in the UK, and I don't know if you're familiar with it here, but it's the Whig interpretation of history. So the Whig interpretation of history it's a little bit of a caricature, but it was a form of history that was very popular at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And the form that this history took was extremely self-congratulatory. And it was essentially a story of the moral progress of humanity culminating in the peak of moral civilization that was essentially late Victorian British Empire. Now, obviously, that was nonsense, right? And for people like me who believe that there really are objective moral truths about certain aspects of morality, and that there is such a thing, or at least there's the possibility of moral progress, the risk of falling into the Whig interpretation of history is constantly there, right? So you have to be constantly aware that you're not falling into that trap, that you're not assuming that just because this is the way that we view things, that this is the final and complete, perfect description of what morality is. In fact, the possibility of moral progress, I think, and I kind of hinted at this before, it should give us exactly the opposite approach or impression. We should be constantly aware that we may be as ignorant about the truth of morality as people who engaged in the slave trade 200 years ago were. That there may be large components of what we think about right and wrong that simply is incorrect and unsustainable. And we hope that future generations, I mean, just as my generation, in some small ways, I think have made genuine contributions to the way that we understand the ethics of war, I hope and believe that your generation will do the same things and that you will expose the errors and inconsistencies and the morally indefensible aspects of our view. And that process will continue. But I mean, equally, I'm sure as much as I can be that certain aspects of our moral view are true and genuine and also universal. And I would say that certain beliefs that we have about certain core rights fall within that. The fact that people ought never to be tortured, and the fact that people ought never to be subject to rape or sexual abuse, the fact that people ought not to be killed or imprisoned or incarcerated unless they've done something to make themselves liable to that. Those very, very basic elements, you might think of them as being similar to some of the very basic core aspects of science. It's not impossible that they will be overturned at some time in the future, but it's very hard to see how they could be. They seem so deeply at the core of the way that we think about the normative world. But I think progress occurs, it's possible, and it's desirable.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Rodin, thank you so much for coming to speak to the class 2018 tonight. I know there's a lot that could be gained from all the questions you raised, and I know they'll have a lot to think about as they go back to their ethics classes. On behalf of the Stockdale Center and the class of 2018 United States Naval Academy, I'd like to present you with this token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much.